At my husband's funeral, the daughter-in-law said, "Hope the money comes soon." I stayed silent. Then told her I inherited everything. The funeral was small. Asheville always had a way of making sorrow feel a little too scenic, sunlight streaking through stained glass, the Blue Ridge soft in the distance. Jack would have hated all the fuss. He wasn't a man of spectacle. His voice, when he was alive, rarely rose above a low hum. But people spoke kindly of him, old students, quiet neighbors, the retired librarian he once walked home in the rain. They remembered him as gentle, dependable. A man who listened more than he spoke. I stood in the front pew with my hands clasped loosely, one gloved and one bare. I couldn't feel the warmth of Mark's arm beneath mine. My son, tall now, graying early like his father did, but quieter than I remembered. Next to him, Lindsay wore a black silk dress that didn't quite crease when she sat. Her hair was perfect. Her shoes too high. She touched my hand once during the service, but it felt more like a courtesy than comfort. Afterwards, I stepped into the garden behind the chapel. The roses were out of season, mostly stems and memory. I stood near the fountain where Jack used to drop coins, always the same wish, "Let them be okay when I'm gone." That's when I heard her voice. Crisp. Cheerful. "Hope the money comes soon. We've waited long enough." She was on the phone, tucked behind the hedge near the stone bench. She didn't know I was there. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Just listened. It wasn't shock that hit me. Not even anger. Just a dull settling in my chest. Like something heavy clicking into place. Lindsay laughed at something the person said. A light, practiced sound. Then the call ended. I turned back toward the chapel, the hem of my coat brushing the gravel. Inside, someone was asking about the reception. Mark's voice floated toward me, soft, tired. I walked in and smiled. But something inside me, something small and essential, had already begun to harden. They said they would stay for a few days. Just to help, to ease the transition. Lindsay said it like a prescription, dry and practical. Mark added something about it being better not to be alone so soon after the funeral. I didn't argue. I simply made up the guest bed and left fresh towels in the hallway linen closet. By the second morning, Lindsay had taken over the kitchen. I woke early, as I always do, and found the cabinet doors open, the pantry half emptied, and a new set of glass containers lined neatly on the counter. My spice rack, the one Jack built from cedar slats, had been emptied into the trash bin. "These were expired," she said, not looking up. "You'll feel better once everything's simplified." She was always efficient. By midweek, the curtains in the living room were gone. The ones I sewed myself from linen I ordered out of a catalog. She replaced them with stiff panels in a muted gray that matched her handbag. I asked where the old ones were, and she smiled and said, "Oh, I thought you wouldn't mind." She used that smile a lot. In small ways, the house changed. She relabeled jars, rearranged the silverware drawer, removed the rug from under the dining table and said it was a tripping hazard. The couch cushions were rotated. The books on Jack's shelf were boxed up, except for 3 she said looked neutral enough to display. Every evening, I sat in my chair by the window with a teacup that grew cold before I drank from it. Mark sat on the couch, mostly scrolling his phone, offering polite remarks about traffic, the stock market, the weather. Lindsay would often mention how hard it must be to manage a house this size alone. "It's really too much for one person," she said one night, buttering toast like she owned the kitchen. "Don't you think, Mark?" He didn't meet my eyes. He never did when she said those things. Just nodded, once, like a man who had made peace with being elsewhere in the room. That night, I lingered longer than usual after they'd gone to bed. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The lamp over the sink flickered slightly as it always had. I ran my fingers along the edge of the counter, where Jack used to tap his ring as he talked. The laminate was worn smooth. Lindsay had left behind a list taped to the fridge. Ideas for simplifying. Donate unused dishes. Cancel landline, no one uses these anymore. Schedule home evaluation, just to see. She wrote that last line in parentheses, as if it didn't matter. As if it wasn't the only one that did. Later, I opened Jack's dresser drawer. Not to look for anything. Just to feel the weight of a place no longer shared. The scent of his aftershave was faint now, like something you remember more than actually sense. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stayed there until the sky lightened. They had said they came to help. But I could feel it, this wasn't help. This was clearing ground. Making space. Prepping something that had already been decided. And the house began to feel unfamiliar. Not because it had changed. But because I had. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. I had gone out to refill a prescription, calcium tablets and ointment for my left knee, nothing urgent. The weather was overcast. The kind of sky Jack used to call a thinking sky. I walked slower than usual. Took the long way back through the park and watched a pair of cardinals bicker in the dogwood trees. When I opened the front door, I heard her voice at once, clear and unguarded. She was in the living room on speakerphone, talking over the hum of the dishwasher. I stayed in the hallway, quiet as a church pew, my hand still on the knob. We could get at least 480, she said. The location's great, and if we move her into assisted living before July, we can close fast. A pause. No, she hasn't seen the paperwork. Mark's working on softening her up. Honestly, it's not going to be a fight. She's too polite for that. The words dropped like stones. I stood there, half in and half out of the house, one foot still on the welcome mat. She laughed, light, pleasant. As if she were planning brunch, not the dismantling of someone's life. My life. Mark's voice surfaced faintly in the background. I couldn't make out what he said. But he wasn't protesting. I didn't enter the room. I didn't call out. Instead, I turned, walked quietly down the hall to the bedroom, and shut the door with a click softer than breath. The window was open a sliver. The air smelled of wet soil and old leaves. I sat down at my desk, opened the top drawer, and reached for the envelope where I kept Jack's letters. There were 6 of them. He started writing them after his diagnosis. Small notes, always signed the same way, yours, still. The final one was dated 3 months before he passed. The handwriting was shakier than usual, but the meaning was steady. If anything happens, it read, I've taken care of everything. Don't let them push you. This is still your home. Below the letter was the name of his attorney, Martin Atkins. I hadn't thought of Mr. Atkins in years. We'd used him when we made our wills, simple documents, drawn up after Mark was born, updated twice since. The last time, Jack insisted we include a contingency. I hadn't paid much attention at the time. But Jack had. That evening, I called the number. Mr. Atkins answered on the second ring, his voice as flat and precise as I remembered. Mrs. Carter, he said after I introduced myself, your husband prepared a file. Asked me to hold it until you contacted me, or until other parties initiated action against your estate. I said nothing for a moment. Just sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, the silence in my room louder than ever. Would you be able to come in tomorrow morning? He asked. It's better we speak in person. I told him I would. The next morning, I put on the navy coat Jack always said brought out my eyes. Not because I was trying to make a statement, just because it felt like armor. The law office sat at the edge of downtown, in a sandstone building that hadn't changed since Reagan was in office. Mr. Atkins greeted me at the door, offered coffee I declined, and led me to a small room with too much beige. He opened a folder and laid out several papers in neat columns. Your husband was thorough, he said gently. He created a clause in the will. If, at any point, you are pressured or coerced to leave your home without documented medical necessity, the property is no longer inherited by your son. Instead, it is to be liquidated and the full amount donated to the Parkinson's Research Foundation. I stared at the papers. Not because I didn't believe them, but because I suddenly understood how deeply Jack had known me. Known what could happen. Known who might let it happen. There were signatures. Witnesses. A notarized seal. He wanted to make sure you were never pushed aside, Mr. Atkins said, his hands folded gently on the desk. And that anyone trying would be discouraged. I nodded. There wasn't much to say. I took copies of the documents with me, slipped them into a plain manila folder, and tucked it into my coat like it was something fragile. When I got home, the house was quiet. Mark was in the garage. Lindsay was in the den, flipping through a stack of glossy brochures. They didn't see me. And I didn't interrupt. I made tea. Sat at the kitchen table. And began preparing. Not for confrontation. For clarity. Because now I had something more than grief. I had my voice. And it was made of paper and law and Jack's unwavering care. I didn't argue with them. Not after that day. Lindsay continued her campaign of cheerful intrusion, dropping magazine articles about downsizing, suggesting I look at community activities at Silver Pines, leaving coupons for orthopedic slippers on the kitchen table. Mark barely looked up when I passed him in the hallway. He had settled into a kind of passive orbit around her. I knew the shape of that silence. I had lived through it once, early in our marriage, when Jack's father had tried to impose his opinions on our home. Back then, Jack held the line. But Mark watched the line blur and said nothing. I stopped making dinner. Stopped offering coffee. Stopped responding to her little hints and suggestions. I went about my routines quietly, as if I were alone in the house again. Watered the plants. Paid the bills. Folded laundry. I didn't resist what they were doing, just absorbed it, until their presence began to feel like static, something that could be tuned out. That same week, I returned to Mr. Atkins' office. He greeted me with a quiet nod, and we sat at the same desk. This time, I had brought my own questions. I wanted to understand the structure of the will. The reach of the clause. The limits of power. He was patient. Explained everything without condescension. Jack's clause, it turned out, was airtight. It didn't just redirect the inheritance if I were removed, it barred any sale of the property for personal gain unless I signed an affidavit confirming the move was medically necessary and entirely voluntary. Without that, the house would be sold, and the proceeds would be routed to the Parkinson's Research Foundation within 30 days. It was all there. In writing. I left the office with a thin file of documents and a quiet certainty. That night, I made 2 copies. One went into the fireproof box in the hallway closet. The other I placed in a plain folder on the kitchen table. The next morning, the brochures appeared again. Neatly stacked between the salt shaker and the napkin holder. Sunny Hills, Oak Retreat, Silver Pines. Lindsay breezed in wearing a peach sweater and soft perfume. We just want what's best for you, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I poured 2 cups of coffee. Set them down gently. Then I slid the folder toward her. Mark reached for it first. Opened it. He read aloud, his voice thin, unsure. Any attempt to remove Eleanor Carter from her residence without medical justification will forfeit the estate. He stopped. Lindsay leaned over his shoulder. Her lips parted, but no words came. I lifted my coffee. Sipped slowly. Then I said, evenly. You said you hoped the money came soon. I stayed silent. But now I'll tell you, I inherited everything. She blinked. Mark looked down. His hand was still on the paper. No one spoke for a long time. Then I stood. Took my cup. Walked to the window. The garden was quiet. Jack's rose bushes were bare, but the soil held promise. Behind me, their chairs scraped back. The front door opened. Then closed. They left the brochures on the table. I didn't move them. Just let them sit there until the light changed. It rained the next morning. Softly, steadily. The kind of rain that doesn't rush you, just keeps falling until it's soaked through everything you thought was dry. I sat in the sunroom, watching drops gather along the edges of the glass. They trailed down slowly, each one pulling the next along, like memories do. Lindsay came in just after 8. She didn't knock. She never did. She had a shopping bag in one hand and a careful smile on her face. "I brought muffins," she said. "Your favorite." "Blueberry." I nodded and gestured toward the table, but I didn't rise. She laid them out neatly on a plate I hadn't used in months, the one with tiny roses around the edge. Then she sat across from me, smoothing the front of her blouse like she was preparing for a negotiation. "I've been thinking," she began, "maybe we got ahead of ourselves. Things were emotional." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of brochures. Again. I glanced at them without touching. "Just information," she added. "Places with good care, nice views, friendly people. You wouldn't be alone." I said nothing. The rain tapped gently against the roof. A moment later, Mark entered, slower than usual. He didn't sit. Just stood behind her, one hand resting awkwardly on the back of her chair. He looked tired. "Mom," he said. "We wanted to include you in the conversation. Maybe we started it too early. We were grieving. Things came out wrong." His voice trailed off. I studied them both. Their posture. The way they didn't quite look at each other. Then I opened the folder I had prepared that morning. Not Jack's documents, those had already done their work. This was simpler. A sheet of paper. Typed. Signed. I placed it gently on the table. Mark picked it up. It was my statement. Not legally binding, but clear. I will not be leaving this home. Not now. Not unless 2 independent doctors declare it medically necessary, in writing. This was my husband's wish. It is mine. Lindsay's mouth opened slightly. But no sound came. Mark read it twice, then lowered it. "I understand," he said quietly. Lindsay looked at him sharply, as if he had just surrendered something important. "She doesn't need a doctor's note to see this place is too much," she said. "This is emotional blackmail. Jack, he blindsided us with that clause." I looked down at my hands. They were steady. "No," I said. "Jack protected me. That's what good men do." Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The roses swayed in the garden bed. The tall pine along the back fence creaked gently, something Jack used to listen for in storms. I rose slowly, walked to the kitchen, and poured the second cup of coffee I'd been holding back. When I returned, they were gone. The muffins sat untouched. The brochures were still on the table. I didn't throw them away. Not yet. There was a kind of quiet satisfaction in letting them sit, unopened, like unopened letters from someone who no longer mattered. Later that afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the yard. The stones along the path needed resetting. The gate to the shed leaned a little too far to one side. There was work to be done, small, ordinary things. But they were mine to do. The turning point hadn't come with a fight. It had come with stillness. I was no longer reacting. I was no longer trying to be heard. I was simply staying. And in staying, I had drawn the only line that mattered. They returned the following Tuesday. No warning. No calls. The sound of the front door opening mid-morning startled me, though I had left it unlocked, as I always did during the day. Old habits are hard to unlearn. Lindsay entered first, carrying a vase of hydrangeas wrapped in foil. Blue and white. Too bright for my table. Mark followed, looking sheepish. His tie was askew, and he smelled faintly of the office, of time passed in waiting rooms and copy machines. They had dressed for apology, soft tones, subdued collars. "I thought I'd brighten the room," Lindsay said, setting the vase on the dining table without asking. Mark said nothing for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke. Maybe we started this conversation too early, he said. We were grieving. Things got ahead of us. He didn't meet my eyes. Lindsay stood by the window now, running her finger along the edge of the glass. I didn't mean to cause tension, she added. We just thought, maybe a change would help you. New surroundings, community. Somewhere restful. I nodded once. Let the quiet settle before I replied. I'm not moving, I said simply. Not now. Not unless two independent doctors tell me I must. That's in Jack's will. And my heart. Mark looked down at his shoes. The floor creaked beneath him. Lindsay turned, her face unreadable. I see, she said. The way she said it, cold and hollow, told me she didn't see at all. But she heard me. And that, for now, was enough. They stayed for less than 10 minutes. Mark hugged me lightly before leaving. The kind of hug you give someone at a bus stop. Short, incomplete. His hand patted my shoulder twice. Lindsay walked out without a word, the vase of flowers forgotten on the table. After the door closed, I carried the flowers to the kitchen sink. Unwrapped the foil. The stems were trimmed too short. The blooms already starting to brown at the edges. Cut to impress, not to last. I poured out the water, watched the cloudy liquid swirl down the drain, then set the empty vase on the counter. For the rest of the day, the house was quiet again. I returned to the slow rhythm of my days. A load of towels folded neatly. Bills arranged in a small wicker tray. The clock in the hallway ticking steady and soft. They hadn't expected resistance. Not this kind. Not quiet, not written, not legally grounded. But Jack had known. He had prepared the ground for my refusal long before the moment came. That night, I made soup. Just enough for one. I ate it at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, where Jack and I used to sit when the dining room felt too formal. The rain started again just after sunset. Gentle. Persistent. It tapped against the windows like a reminder, this house was still mine. They came one last time, 3 days later. No flowers this time. No brochures. Just polite voices and uncertain eyes. Lindsay wore pale blue. Her makeup softer now, less precise. A calculated attempt at warmth. Mark carried a grocery bag, milk, bread, something green in a plastic box. I imagined they had decided this new approach together. Less pressure. More care. They sat in the living room without asking. The air between us held a tension that didn't rise, didn't snap. It just sat there, dense and quiet. Mark was the first to speak. Mom, he said, his voice steady but rehearsed, we talked, and maybe we were wrong to push so soon. Things have been complicated. We were all mourning. Lindsay nodded slightly. We thought you needed support, she said. That maybe you didn't know how much space this house demanded. We were just trying to help. I looked at the fireplace, where Jack's watch still sat on the mantel. It hadn't ticked in years, but I kept it there, its weight familiar, its silence more honest than most words. I'm not leaving, I said. Calm. Clear. Not now. Not unless two independent doctors tell me I must. That's what Jack wrote. That's what I stand by. Mark's mouth parted slightly. Then closed. Lindsay stared, disbelieving, as if I had just overturned something sacred. This house is too much for you, she said, her voice rising just a fraction. Even if you stay, it's only going to get harder. You'll need help. You're 79, Eleanor. I didn't flinch. This house, I said slowly, was built with 38 years of teaching and 39 of marriage. Every corner knows my name. Neither of them answered. Mark looked torn. Between her and me. Between the life he lived now and the one that raised him. And I saw it, he didn't know how to choose. Or if he even could anymore. I stood, carefully, my hands folded. I've made my decision, I said. Lindsay exhaled loudly. A small, sharp breath. She rose and gathered her purse. Mark remained seated for a moment longer. I didn't know about the clause, he said, softly. I swear. I nodded. But you said nothing when she spoke of selling. That's the part that matters. He nodded, too. Then stood. His hands hung loose at his sides. They left quietly. No slammed doors. No final words. After they were gone, I walked the house again, room by room. Not to check anything. Just to remind myself of what still belonged to me. The shelf Jack built in the back room. The uneven step near the hallway. The chair in the study, worn smooth by years of evening reading. It was my house. It was my life. And I had claimed it, not with volume, not with confrontation, but with resolve. It was Chloe who brought the light back into the house. She called on a Thursday evening, her voice bright, a little rushed. Said dorm life was stifling, and her roommate had developed a sudden interest in tarot cards and late-night incense rituals. Grandma, she said, could I stay with you for a while? Just until I figure things out? I didn't hesitate. She arrived 2 days later, carrying a backpack and a grocery bag of folded laundry. Her hair was longer than I remembered, and she wore a sweatshirt 3 sizes too big, sleeves swallowed by her hands. She hugged me hard, with both arms and her whole weight. It smells like comfort here, she said, burying her face in my shoulder. She settled quickly into the back bedroom, the one Jack used to call the sewing room. We cleared out old boxes together, folded afghans, vacuumed the corners. She insisted on doing her own laundry, but left little piles of socks near the washer that always made me smile. We slipped into rhythm. I made breakfast, she made tea. She studied at the kitchen table while I worked in the garden. On weekends, she helped me weed the flower beds. We painted the porch swing a soft gray and laughed when the wind knocked over the paint can. Some days, I caught her watching me with a kind of quiet tenderness I wasn't used to. Not pity. Not worry. Just attention. The kind you give someone when you're old enough to see them as more than a role. I like it here, she said one night as we washed dishes together. It feels stable. I smiled and handed her a towel. She didn't ask questions about her parents. I didn't offer answers. That was the unspoken deal we made. But she knew enough. She had seen enough. And she stayed. I joined a watercolor class at the community center. Tuesday mornings. 10 women, 3 men, all older than me except for one retired dentist who painted only hummingbirds. I wasn't very good, but I liked the quiet brushstrokes. The focus. The way the room held no expectations. At night, I read again. Not the books Jack and I used to trade, but my own choices, quiet novels, histories, a few poems. I kept a notebook nearby and wrote things down sometimes, phrases I liked or names I didn't want to forget. The house grew full again, but not in the way it had before. Not with pressure. Not with plans that excluded me. With presence. There was still grief. But it had softened. The hard edge of it worn smooth by time and tasks and small moments, like Chloe bringing me a mug of cocoa without asking, or the sound of rain on the roof while I brushed my teeth. Mark stopped calling. Lindsay had disappeared altogether. I didn't mind. The garden began to bloom again. Jack's roses were late, but they came, slow and stubborn, just like him. One afternoon, as Chloe packed for a weekend field trip, she paused by the door and turned. You know, she said, I think Grandpa would be proud of you. I didn't reply. Just touched the frame on the wall beside me, our wedding photo. His smile, my veil, the soft blur of the past. She closed the door behind her. And I sat, alone but not lonely, in a house that still held its memory, its breath, its promise. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. No return address, but I recognized Lindsay's handwriting immediately, tight, clean, slightly slanted to the right. The envelope was cream, thicker than usual, like something you'd choose for a wedding invitation. I held it for a while before opening it. Let it rest on the kitchen table while I brewed tea and folded 2 dish towels I hadn't used in years. I didn't feel dread. Just a small ache of weariness. The kind that comes when something you've already buried tries to climb back through the soil. When I opened it, the letter was short. Eleanor. Let's talk. It's time to move forward. Lindsay. That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had passed. Just 5 words and a signature that felt more like a brand than a name. I folded the note back along its crease and walked it to the hallway dresser. The drawer stuck a little, as always. I placed the letter beside old bank receipts, 1 dried rose from Jack's memorial, and a photograph of Mark at 8, wearing a papier-mâché hat he'd made for Colonial Day at school. The drawer clicked shut. I didn't mention the letter to Chloe. There was no need. That evening, we made soup together, carrot and ginger. She grated the ginger too finely, and the soup came out sharper than expected, but she laughed, and I smiled, and we ate it with crackers and old stories. I went to bed early. Lay in the quiet and stared at the ceiling, where the corners of the room gathered shadow. I thought about all the rooms I had entered over the years where I was expected to make peace, smooth things over, lessen the tension others created. But not this time. Some bridges are better left burned. Not in anger. Not in vengeance. Just in clarity. A week passed. Then 2. The house stayed still, gentle. Chloe came and went between classes. She started bringing back herbs from the co-op near campus. We planted thyme in a ceramic pot that had once held petunias. It sat in the kitchen window, catching light. The quiet changed shape. It wasn't the quiet of being dismissed, or ignored, or erased. It was the quiet of chosen solitude. Of enough. I dusted the bookshelf and moved Jack's biographies to a lower shelf. I donated the stack of magazines Lindsay had left behind months ago. Their covers showed smiling women and titles like Reclaim Your Best Years. I didn't need reclaiming. I hadn't lost anything. I had returned to myself. Some nights I still missed him, Jack. The way he stirred sugar into his tea without looking. The way he knew when not to speak. But when I sat in his chair and looked out into the garden, I felt his presence in the ordinary things. In the rake leaned against the shed. In the bird bath he cleaned every Sunday. In the quiet, steady love he left behind. And I knew he'd understand. He'd understand why the letter went unopened after that first day. Why I didn't call. Why I didn't respond. Because the hardest part of aging isn't the ache in your knees or the forgetting of small names. It's the realization that love, real love, doesn't demand you vanish. It remembers you. Includes you. Stands beside you. And when it doesn't, you are allowed to walk away. Even from your own blood. I opened the back door just after 6 that morning. The air was crisp, one of those Carolina mornings that carries both the end of summer and the start of something cooler. I stepped out with my tea, Jack's old cardigan draped over my shoulders, and stood still. The garden was quiet. The roses had nearly finished blooming. The thyme in the kitchen window had taken to the light and grown wild at the edges, soft and fragrant. Chloe had tied it back with a piece of string last week. Said it looked like it needed a haircut. The house was still. Not heavy anymore. Not empty either. Just still. A letter had come from Mark yesterday. It was longer than Lindsay's. 4 pages. Handwritten. He wrote about memory, how he missed our backyard cookouts, how he remembered helping Jack dig out the corner post for the old shed. He said he'd gotten it wrong. That he hadn't known how much silence could wound. That he hoped there was still room for him, somewhere. I read it twice. Then set it down beside the other letter, unopened. I didn't write back. Some doors, once shut, stay shut, not from spite, but from preservation. The mail had brought other things too. A small note from the watercolor group reminding me about the fall showcase. A card from the local grocer, "Thank you for your loyalty, Mrs. Carter." And a small envelope with a pressed leaf from Chloe, who had gone to visit friends for the weekend. She wrote, "This reminded me of the way your garden smells after rain." Inside the house, everything felt tended. Not curated. Not staged. Just lived in. The table still had faint rings from warm mugs. The bookshelf leaned slightly to one side. A photograph of Jack and me, taken before Mark was born, stood by the hallway mirror. I passed it every day. Not because I needed to remember, but because I already did. I made a list that afternoon: things to mend, recipes to try, books I hadn't touched in years. At the bottom, I wrote just one sentence. They thought I was fragile. They forgot, I was forged by fire. And I folded that paper into the drawer with the others, not to save it, not to mark a final thought, but to leave something behind for myself. Not a legacy. A reminder.